The Royal College of Obstetricians and Gynaecologists admits few, if any, babies are likely to come to real harm if they're exposed to the chemicals found in everything from food wrapping to cosmetics and cars. Nonetheless, it suggests women should play it safe and err on the side of caution.
The document does not outline things that women should avoid during pregnancy. What the document outlines is the fact that for a while we have been concerned about certain chemicals that may be present in our environment. We do not know what the risks are, but we wish to make women more aware of this, giving them the information that they might find helpful so that they can make decisions to change their lifestyle. The problem with determining effects of any chemical exposure, especially mixtures of different chemicals, means that it's a long time. It'll be a long time before we would even know if there are any risks. What we hope to do with this document is have a proactive approach so that we could give women the information and so they can make informed choices.
Its report gives a list of things women could avoid or cut back on. These include food and drink in cans and plastic containers, like ready meals, cosmetics and toiletries such as moisturisers, shower gel and fragrances. Pregnant women could also avoid buying new furniture, fabrics, non-stick frying pans and cars. But many experts have criticised the advice for being alarmist. The Royal College of Midwives said pregnant women should take the advice with caution and use their common sense and judgment.
All around us are the products of modern chemistry. Window shades, draperies, upholstery, and furniture. All are made of or covered with something that came out of a test tube. Radio cabinets, tabletops, and hundreds of other useful articles are made of new plastics created in the chemist's laboratory.
For instance, if you wanted to go to a chemist and say, look, I want to have a chemical, say a pesticide, which will persist throughout the food chain, and I don't want it to have to renew it very, very often. I'd like it to be relatively non-destructible. And then he'd put two benzene molecules on the blackboard and add a chlorine here and a chlorine that, and that was DDT.
When the 8th Army needed Jap civilians to help them out in our occupation, they called on native doctors to administer DDT under the supervision of our men to stem a potential typhus epidemic. Dusting like this goes a long way in checking disease, and the laughs are them. Pardon our dust.
As the petrochemical era grew and grew, warning signs emerged that some of these chemicals could pose hazards. The data initially were trivial, anecdotal, but gradually a body of data started accumulating to the extent that we now know that the synthetic chemicals which have permeated our workplace, our consumer products, our air, our water, produce cancer and also birth defects and some other toxic effects. Furthermore, industry has known about this, at least most industries have known about this, and have attempted to trivialize these risks.
Today, thanks to human ingenuity, over 100,000 new chemicals synthesized in laboratories fashion the world we live in. We've introduced these amazing molecules into our environment without really considering whether nature would be able to recognize them and break them down.
Our modern environment now includes over 80,000 synthetic chemicals, with around 1,000 new ones being created every year. More than 500 of these are known to cause cancer or to disrupt the hormones in the body. Of the substances that are strongly linked to breast cancer, many are chemically similar to estrogen. Estrogen is a natural hormone that promotes female characteristics, and our cells recognise it by its phenyl ring. However, many synthetic chemicals also hold these phenyl rings. This can cause them to have estrogen mimicking effects. These estrogen mimics can cause problems by taking the place of natural estrogen and turning effects on or off in the cells at the wrong times. Because of this hormone disrupting effect, the estrogen mimics are classed as endocrine disrupting chemicals, or EDCs.
A hormone is an organic molecule secreted by an endocrine gland in response to a physiological signal or signals, which are carried through the blood to a target tissue where it intervenes to produce a biological response. Hormones are chemically categorized into several classes, proteins of which a primary example can be growth hormone or prolactin. Peptides, which are small building blocks of proteins. Good examples of a peptide hormone are insulin, oxytocin, or parathyroid hormone. A third category is amino acid-derived hormones. These include thyroxine from the thyroid gland or epinephrine from the adrenals. And a fourth category is fatty acid-derived hormones. A major example are prostaglandins. Finally, the last class of hormones is steroids. Good examples of steroids are estradiol and testosterone, the sex steroids, and as well the glucocorticoids.
Importantly, these chemicals aren't only found in factories or behind laboratory doors, as they are all around us in our environment and everyday products. You can find EDCs in many toiletries, detergents, plastic containers, and many other sources. So what are the long-term effects of EDCs? Scientists have found that they can promote the growth of breast cancer cells and hormonally sensitive tumours. They've also found that EDCs interfere with mammary gland development, such as in the womb and during puberty, and this increases our susceptibility to breast cancer.
There are hundreds of chemicals in the environment that are coming from products that we are using every day. And these chemicals were declared safe dozens of years ago. And now we understand that they can disrupt the endocrine system, the controlling system of our bodies.
Well, our hormone systems are very complex, and everybody must understand it goes beyond the usual sex hormones. There are a lot of hormones. Insulin is a hormone. I don't think most people understand that. And we have an epidemic of diabetes and obesity, all connected, in the Northern Hemisphere, that now, basically, some of the most recent studies, and even a human study, showed a link between a very commonly used plastic called bisphenol A and diabetes, obesity, and cardiovascular problems.
What we used to think was that we could use high-dose testing to predict what's going to happen at low levels. That's how all regulatory toxicology works. We used to think that that was sufficient. But that was before we began to realize that some contaminants, like bisphenol A, behave like hormones. And the people that study hormones, endocrinologists, have known for years that what happens at high doses isn't necessarily the same as what happens at low doses. So all of a sudden, as toxicology is confronted with this new way of looking at chemical action, they have to throw out one of their most basic assumptions, that the dose makes the poison.
The numbers are so small that they're beyond the comprehension of most people. That's how small they are. So you think of a part per thousand, a part per million, a part per billion, a part per trillion. A natural hormone, below a part per trillion, it can stimulate breast cancer cells to grow. And now we are seeing chemicals like bisphenol A that are what hard, clear plastic is made out of, and the lining of cans is made out of. It can stimulate breast cancer cells at below a part per trillion, just like the natural hormone.
Those most threatened by toxic chemicals are not adults. They are children and babies. But the most vulnerable of all have not even been born.
There is no question that the most serious effects are to the unborn child, because the effects are permanent and because the fetus has very few defenses against these chemicals.
This is a time when all the cells are starting to divide from each other, developing into organs. And this can start as early as 6 weeks, even earlier, after conception.
Until recently, doctors believed that the fetus was protected from contamination by the placental barrier. But the womb provides no such protection.
Everything that the mother is exposed to could potentially expose the fetus. The difference is that the fetus is exquisitely sensitive, many, many more times more sensitive than the mother, and so it's much more dangerous.
These test tubes contain umbilical cord blood. We've analyzed thousands of them and found pollutants such as heavy metals, organochlorine pesticides, PCBs, and that means that the mother was exposed to these pollutants and transmitted them through her bloodstream to her unborn child.
For several weeks after conception, the embryo is neither male nor female. Sex hormones orchestrate the process that determines whether the fetus will be a boy or a girl. In the 7th week of pregnancy, the male reproductive tract begins developing. Chemical exposures are likely behind a 200% increase in male genital birth defects.
Concept for people to remember is that this hand and the fin of a dolphin and the wing of a bat, at the early embryo stage, they look identical. And inside of the wing of a bat and inside of the fin of the dolphin is a hand. So at the beginning of development of a fish or a frog or a mouse or a human, the early stages of development that are disrupted by endocrine disruptors and the genetic mechanisms are almost identical. We end up looking different, but don't let that deceive you. The mechanisms of development are very, very similar, and the disruption events of development lead to diseases in all of these species. We have proven that in animals, if you expose during the time that you start out, your body starts out as one single cell and then becomes 2 cells and 4 cells and many cells. And we know that as one cell is becoming many other cells, the hormones that control that, if you disrupt them, then you permanently alter the genes in the new cells. And when you do that at the beginning of life, those cells and all of the cells that come from them are defective. And the consequence is that, for instance, after puberty, when the reproductive system starts forming, abnormalities in the organs that after puberty begin to develop, like the female uterus, suddenly you start to see diseases of that organ. You don't see the disease in a child because the uterus is not functioning yet.
So not just one system. This could be the development of the brain, which basically the brain at that time is getting programmed for how an individual is going to develop later in life as well. So their behavior is being affected. Intelligence could be affected.
After birth, the infant is further exposed to chemicals in the mother's breast milk.
There's no question that when you show that mother's milk has contaminants, and then you actually look at babies, and you can actually take a blood sample or a urine sample and show that those contaminants are not only in that child, but they stay in that child.
Genetics plays a potentially very important role in determining the effects of early life exposures on children's health and development. So, for example, we're looking at the effects of environmental exposures, physical toxicants in the environment, common everyday pollutants that we experience, particularly in urban areas, air pollutants, bisphenol A, phthalates, pesticides, at the low levels to which we're generally exposed. So and we have observed some relationships between fetal exposures, prenatal exposures, and health effects in children following a cohort of children for a number of years from in utero forward into childhood and even adolescence. So we look upon epigenetics as a potentially very important mechanism in mediating those effects and in helping us to link exposures to the clinical outcomes that we're measuring. And in doing so, elucidate the mechanisms by which this damage is incurring, which we hope very much will be useful in prevention, in designing effective interventions, and also in monitoring the efficacy of those interventions. We're specifically hypothesizing that prenatal exposure to environmental contaminants, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons from fossil fuel burning, other combustion sources, secondhand tobacco smoke, pesticides used for control of indoor pests in urban areas, and what are called endocrine disrupting chemicals, bisphenol A and phthalates, that they are having an effect when the fetus is exposed through the mother's environmental exposure, that they are having an effect on children's neurodevelopment, neurobehavior particularly, on asthma risk, and obesity and metabolic disorders. And further, that they may be increasing the risk of intermediate damage associated with cancer. So we further theorize that in addition to genotoxic pathways that can be important for some of these chemical exposures, pollutant exposures, that epigenetics may be involved. And we're studying that both within our cohorts of mothers and newborns who are enrolled during the pregnancy period and then followed for many years into adolescence. Our oldest children are now approaching the age of 12 and 13. We theorize that we will be able to draw better links between those early exposures and the outcomes by understanding and measuring the epigenetic changes, both that we determine in the cord blood at birth, looking also at placental tissue, and then further following and analyzing the samples from those children at older ages. So we further theorize that the prenatal period will be a window of exquisite susceptibility to these exposures. So those are our hypotheses. We're not leaving out, however, the broader context, the social context in which individuals are living, to which they're reacting on a daily basis. So we are looking at psychosocial stressors, also genetic susceptibility, because we think there's an important interaction between genetic susceptibility and other environmental factors, and nutritional factors. So our studies are attempting to capture those things as best we can, and to look at the relationships among them. I think that through more understanding of the pathways that are involved in the effects that are observed in relation to early life exposures, prenatal and early postnatal exposures, that through that understanding we can craft really effective and targeted interventions. Those will include behavioral interventions, educational programs, for example, nutritional interventions, and people are talking about pharmacological interventions as well. My area, focusing on preventable environmental exposures, in my area, we tend to think of policy changes that can dramatically affect the environment of a population, and actually dealing especially with involuntary exposures that are problematic, such as, for example, air pollution. So we think in terms of how scientific data can inform policies, regulatory and other kinds of policies, to address those environmental threats. I mentioned our exploring, really the word is exploring, the interactions between the environmental exposures, the physical toxicants that we're interested in, and the other factors, genetic susceptibility, nutritional susceptibility, psychosocial stressors, all of which can worsen, exacerbate the effect of the physical toxicants. Those studies, because our cohorts are fairly limited in size, we enrolled about 740 women in pregnancy and are following them and their children. Those are fairly limited. We consider them to be exploratory, but that it's important to attempt to assess those at this point, and then hopefully we'll be able to do larger studies in the future.
I think we're only just beginning to realize how important that cocktail effect is. It's extremely difficult to study. It's expensive, time-consuming. But what the animal studies, very carefully conducted animal studies, have shown is that when you take these chemicals at levels at which individual chemicals have no effect, then together they can have big effects. And again, the effects that we're talking about that have been studied so far are on male reproductive development, so they will include this time window of vulnerability. And the implications of that are enormous, because it means that when you look at one chemical that we may be exposed to low levels of, and which is, you may think this will have no effect, you can't look at it like that. You must say, what else are you exposed to, and how will those add up?
So you move in a what we call dose additive way from no effect on each of the chemicals to combining them and having a very large effect. So I think it's something that everyone is familiar with. If you go to the doctor, your doctor says, what else are you taking before I prescribe this, right? But we don't do that with the chemicals.
We're just beginning to understand that chemistry. That chemistry operates in the range of parts per trillion and parts per billion, which industry has told us for years it's harmless. Concentrations like that are unimportant. But when you interrupt a vital system, something that's developing where these eggs are splitting and developing and budding and forming legs and arms and duct systems and glands, at a part per trillion, these are very dangerous chemicals.
Fred Vomsal of the University of Missouri and Don Tillett of the U.S. Geological Survey live and work in the nation's heartland. Alarmed by rising numbers of wild animals found with bizarre developmental and reproductive problems, they've joined a national effort to find the cause. The prime suspects include pesticides, the residue of birth control pills and other drugs in treated wastewater, and a compound found in many familiar plastics, bisphenol A.
The problem with chemicals such as bisphenol A is it breaks out of the plastic and leaches into water.
Studies show that from water, this chemical can get into animals, and there it can act like a dose of the female sex hormone estrogen. Too much estrogen can disrupt the endocrine system, and that's been linked to a wide range of health impacts, including gender bending. One critical unanswered question is at what level of exposure these effects occur. With bisphenol A, we're talking about extremely small quantities of this chemical getting into the environment. Samples drawn from this stream had only 30 parts per trillion. Vomsal is worried because studies show tiny amounts of bisphenol A can derail early cell development in mice. And if mice are vulnerable, might people be as well? Recently, Vomsal tested clear plastic baby bottles to see if they release bisphenol A. He devised the simplest of experiments. Let distilled water sit in brand new bottles for 24 hours and then test it. Every one released bisphenol A. Curious, he then decided to see what happens when the same baby bottles are run through an ordinary dishwasher, which heats them to 140 degrees.
Some of these bottles, by the time we had washed them 10 times, were leaching 10 times more bisphenol A than they had before they had been washed.
The plastics industry vigorously disputes any danger to children from the chemical. They cite the continued blessing of the U.S. Food and Drug Administration.
Bisphenol A, or BPA, is a chemical that is much discussed these days. BPA is the essential ingredient used to manufacture both polycarbonate plastics and epoxy resins. Polycarbonate is a transparent plastic providing solidity, lightweight, and shatter resistance to a wide variety of products, from solar panels to mobile phone casings, from safety helmets to car bumpers or to DVDs, to name just a few of its many applications. Epoxy resins are mostly used as coatings. They provide excellent anti-corrosions and antibacterial protection, as well as elasticity and versatility. Applications using epoxies range from sports equipment to car parts, from tin cans to construction panels, from wind turbine blades to tankers or home appliances. You name it. But what about the BPA that is bonded in these materials? Is it safe? Scientists from academia, government, and industry have been studying BPA extensively over the years. In fact, no other chemical has undergone such a wide range of testing. Research shows that we absorb very low levels of BPA when drinking or eating from material made using BPA. Our body is very effective at quickly transforming these very low BPA residues into an inactive kind of sugar, which we excrete via the urine rapidly. But recently, controversy has emerged among scientists about the possibility that BPA may have harmful effects on humans. Some scientists claim that BPA causes or contributes to cause a series of diseases, while others confirm that, as it is used safely, bisphenol A has no harmful effects on humans. So what are the facts? Is there cause for concern? Like other chemicals, be they natural or man-made, BPA can weakly act like an estrogen, the primary female sex hormone. Does this intake of external estrogen cause any damage to our hormonal system? Many things we eat each day trigger hormonal changes in our bodies, with no adverse effect. For example, Carrots and soybeans contain natural hormone-like chemical components. The levels at which we are exposed to BPA do not raise concerns for any damage to our hormonal systems. And many of these estrogen-like compounds are far more active than BPA. In fact, one person would have to eat 600 kilos of food in contact with BPA-based polycarbonate utensils to ingest the same amount of estrogen-like compounds that he would absorb from eating 150 grams plate of carrots. BPA has been found in urine and blood samples of people affected with diseases such as cancer, obesity, or diabetes. There are many different risk factors for these diseases, and often they're associated with lifestyle and behaviors. Physical inactivity, unhealthy diets, drinking, and smoking are all identified risk factors. The mere presence of BPA in blood and urine samples does not mean it causes cancer, obesity, or diabetes. For example, people drinking beverages from cans coated with epoxy resins will display some BPA in their urine. But to reach a level at which BPA would become harmful, a 60 kilos person would have to drink more than 1,800 cans a day. So, for BPA, as for any other chemical, let's look at the facts, investigate examples, and use our best judgment before jumping to any hasty conclusion as regards the safety of a product which plays a key role in food and sanitary protection. From recreation to food, from convenience to shelter, BPA brings many benefits to our daily lives. And while we may have questions on its effects, research and experience show that BPA is safe.
It's not lost on some of you that that is special interest blabber. We heard that from the American Tobacco Institute for years. Remember? 3 studies are equivocal about whether smoking causes cancer.
The record shows that many of the country's most respected doctors openly challenged anti-cigarette claims. A California doctor said, "As a scientist, I find no persuasive evidence that cigarette smoking causes lung cancer." A New York doctor told Congress to claim there is now sufficient scientific evidence to establish that cigarette smoking causes disease is, in my opinion, unjustified. There is another side to the cigarette controversy. It's all here in this white paper. Send for it.
What cigarette do you smoke, Doctor?
Tens of thousands of doctors in all branches of medicine, in all parts of the country, were asked that question. The brand named most was Camel.
Smoke Camels, the cigarette so many doctors enjoy.
This new insect destroyer contains a lot of DDT. Its DDT content is even higher than government specifications. Ideal for vertical surfaces, on fruit and vegetable stands, in cupboards, and it's perfect for ridding Fido of those unwelcome house guests.
This contemporary home shows how modern asbestos materials can be adapted to any style or design. Notice how the asbestos cement sidewalls help add dignity and charm.
Oh, it is attractive.
Yes, and it'll stay that way, too. That's what I like about it.
And they correctly said, and still to this day, we do not know biophysically the precise links between smoking and cancer. So they give you a therefore when there's no therefore there. Therefore, it's premature to act. That's a personal value judgment or risk management. Of course, they protect market share. Whereas the data are so overwhelming epidemiologically, the statistics, that you'd have to be crazy not to control this, even though you don't understand every detail of the mechanisms. How many people in this place, in this fire-prone California, have had a house fire? A few of you. Typically, it's 1% to 2%. How many of you have fire insurance? We already are very risk-averse when we have consequences that matter. We do not need 95% certainty. Supposing you got a spot on your lung from a chest x-ray, which you did for a different purpose than looking for cancer. Well, it could be a healed lesion or it could be the beginning of a tumor. So they were asked what to do. Well, what should we do, doc? Well, do a biopsy. Well, it's hard to get to. We have to do surgery. Surgery has a risk. It's expensive. It's painful. In other words, there's a price for a false positive. If you believe that that could be cancer and you try to take it out, you will pay a price. So, okay, we don't want to pay the price, so let's wait and see. What can we do? And the doc said, well, you can wait, and if it grows, then we better take it out. And of course, this patient said, but what's the chance that if I wait and it grows, that it becomes metastatic, and therefore it'll be too late and I'll be dead, whereas if I take it out now in a precautionary mode, pay the price for the surgery I might not need, I'll have a lower likelihood of being dead. Now, what's the right answer to that? There is no right answer. That's your value judgment.
Chemicals are part of our daily lives. They are everywhere, in our personal care products, cosmetics, toys, cars, furniture, food packages, IT equipment, electrical appliances, everywhere. Consumers strongly believe that chemicals that are on the market have been tested and are safe, but this is far from being true, and a huge majority of chemicals that are on the market have never undergone any risk assessment. Some of them may cause allergies, or cancer, or obesity, or disrupt your hormonal system. Now, this is a problem for all consumers, but this is especially a problem for elderly people, for young children, for babies, and for pregnant women. And studies have shown that there are already hundreds of chemicals in the blood of newborn babies. We have particular concerns with endocrine disruptors. Those are chemicals that disrupt your hormonal system and can lead to problems of fertility, to cancers, early puberty, and obesity. Now, those substances can be really harmful, and they can have long-term effects even at a low dose.
American people expect that all chemicals used in the American economy are safe. But, Mr. Chairman, the 30-year-old law that gives EPA that authority is outdated.
It means that you're leaving it up to the public and the political world to figure that out for themselves. They're capable of it, but they rarely do it.
Breast Cancer UK is taking a stand on the high levels of these dangerous chemicals in our environment. Currently, we are leading a focused campaign against a pervasive EDC called bisphenol A, which is found in many plastics. Due to the cancer risk, Canada has already classified bisphenol A as a toxin, and, along with the US, they are drawing up new laws to phase it out of babies' products. But the UK government has not acknowledged these dangers, as they argue that there is not yet enough conclusive evidence on how bisphenol A affects people. This may appear reasonable, but scientists have so far been unable to carry out a conclusive human trial. With no time for delay, we need to consult the evidence that is available. There have been many persuasive studies on laboratory rats and mice. They consistently demonstrated that exposure to bisphenol A in the womb and around the time of birth leads to alterations in mammary tissue, which can go on to develop into tumours. Importantly, the subjects were given environmentally relevant amounts of bisphenol A, low concentrations of the chemical, just as any person would encounter in everyday life. Studies have also been carried out on cultures of human breast cancer cells. They demonstrated that bisphenol A can activate estrogen receptors and encourage the multiplication of cancer cells. Further studies have shown that exposure to bisphenol A is also very common. The chemical is present in plastic food containers, food can linings, and babies' products, and it has been proven that bisphenol A can leach into what we all eat and drink. 38 of the world's leading scientific experts on bisphenol A have considered all this evidence and warned policymakers about the potentially harmful effects of exposure to the chemical. The evidence shows us that something has to be done.
The Japanese are cutting back in their use of bisphenol A, and recent independent studies have motivated the FDA to take a fresh look.
Every generation before our generation was not living as long as we are living and not as healthy as us. And now what we are seeing is the younger generation with tremendously higher incidence of cancer, of obesity, of diabetes, of neurologic disorders, of brain and behavioral abnormalities, of immune disorders. All of these are caused by environmental endocrine disruptors. And the incidence of all of these diseases in our children are much higher than in my generation.